crowd had already begun to shout before the gates were lifted. Not with anger, not with fear, with anticipation. Somewhere beneath the wooden floor of the arena, a man waited in the dark, breathing air that smelled of damp stone, animal fur, and something older, something metallic that clung to the lungs. Above him, thousands of voices rose and fell like surf against stone. He could hear laughter, vendors shouting, the distant clatter of mechanisms being prepared. Someone pressed a helmet into his hands. It did not fit. A moment later, the floor above him trembled as a massive gate opened somewhere in the arena. A roar rolled downward through the corridors. The man froze. The spectacle had already begun, and he was next. 2,000 years later, when people imagine the Roman arena, they picture combat, two trained fighters circling each other beneath a merciless sun, shields clashing, the crowd roaring for victory. But the reality of Rome's spectacles was far stranger and far darker. The amphitheatre was not simply a place where people fought. It was a stage where the empire performed its understanding of power. And sometimes the performance required something more disturbing than a duel. To understand why tens of thousands of Roman citizens once filled arenas to watch strangers die, we have to step back into the world that created those spectacles. A world where politics, religion, entertainment, and violence were not separate things at all. In the Roman Republic, public bloodshed did not begin as entertainment. At least, that is the explanation later historians preferred. Ancient sources tell us that the earliest gladiatorial combats took place in 264 BC during a funeral ceremony. According to tradition, the sons of a Roman nobleman arranged for slaves to fight beside their father's tomb. The combat was meant as an offering, blood spilled in honour of the dead. The Romans called this ritual a munus, a duty, but even ancient writers quietly admitted that the crowds who gathered to watch these early fights were larger than any private funeral could explain. Word spread quickly when blood was promised, and soon, what began as ritual obligation began to evolve into something else. A public attraction. By the 1st century BC, the Roman world had transformed the idea completely. Politicians discovered that sponsoring games could buy popularity more effectively than speeches ever could. Victorious generals celebrated triumphs by staging enormous spectacles. Exotic animals were brought from across the empire. Lions from North Africa, bears from distant mountains, elephants captured after wars. The arena became a symbol of Rome's reach. Every creature dragged into the sand was proof that the empire's power extended to the edges of the known world, and every death was part of the message. When the massive amphitheatre we now call the Colosseum opened in the year 80 AD, under the Emperor Titus, the celebration lasted 100 days. Ancient writers claimed that thousands of animals died during those games. The number sounds unbelievable, but Rome possessed something few societies in history had achieved: a logistical system capable of feeding spectacle on an industrial scale. Ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying cages. Caravans transported animals from deserts and forests. Entire networks of hunters, traders, and trainers existed solely to supply the arena. What the crowd saw for a few moments in the sand was the final step in a vast chain of preparation. And that chain did not move only animals. It moved people. Some of the men who fought in the arena were professionals. Gladiators trained for years in specialized schools. They practiced with wooden weapons, followed strict diets, and received medical treatment advanced for its time. Successful fighters could become celebrities. Crowds admired their skill. Graffiti across Roman cities praised favorite champions. Some gladiators even survived long enough to earn freedom. But these men represented only part of the spectacle. The Roman arena required another category of participant, people who were never expected to survive. Prisoners captured in distant wars, slaves accused of rebellion, criminals condemned by the courts. Roman law described many of these punishments with a phrase that translated simply as condemnation to the beasts. It meant exactly what it sounded like. During the middle hours of the day, when the sun stood highest and the crowd had already watched hours of combat, these condemned individuals were brought into the arena, and what followed was rarely a simple execution. Rome understood something essential about storytelling. A death by itself was brief, but a story could make an audience stay. So the executions were staged as scenes. A condemned man might be dressed as a mythological figure and forced to reenact a famous legend. Another might be placed inside a contraption designed to replicate a punishment from ancient mythology. The spectators watched not merely a person dying, but a narrative unfolding. The victim ceased to be an individual. He became a character. The Roman poet Martial once described an execution in which a prisoner was made to portray the musician Orpheus, the mythical figure whose songs could tame wild animals. In the legend, beasts gather peacefully to hear his music. In the arena, the animals were not interested in the performance. The myth collapsed instantly, but the audience had already accepted the premise of the story, and that acceptance made the violence easier to watch. This transformation from person to symbol was the quiet mechanism that allowed the arena to function. Because the spectators were not simply witnessing cruelty, they were participating in a ritual that reinforced the structure of Roman society. At the very top of that structure stood the emperor. Emperors used the arena to demonstrate generosity and control. Grand spectacles reminded citizens that their ruler possessed the wealth and authority to command the entire world's resources for a single afternoon's entertainment. Some emperors embraced the spectacle more enthusiastically than others. Julius Caesar once flooded a specially constructed basin in Rome to stage a mock naval battle involving thousands of condemned fighters. Later, Claudius organized another massive naval reenactment on a lake outside the city. According to one ancient account, the prisoners forced to participate shouted a desperate greeting to the emperor before the battle began. "Those who are about to die salute you." The line has echoed through history ever since. But what matters more is how the crowd responded. They watched, they cheered, and when the spectacle ended, the city returned to its ordinary routines. For centuries, this pattern repeated itself across the Roman world. Amphitheatres appeared in provincial towns from Britain to North Africa. Each one reproduced the same architecture: tiered seating, hidden corridors, mechanisms capable of raising animals and fighters into the arena floor within seconds. Beneath the Colosseum itself stretched a labyrinth of tunnels known as the Hypogeum. Recent archaeological work has revealed carvings scratched into its walls, names, tally marks, rough drawings of animals. These markings were left by people who waited there. Some of them may have been gladiators preparing for combat. Others were prisoners who understood exactly what awaited them when the gates opened. For those waiting underground, the worst part may not have been the arena itself. It was the waiting. From the darkness below, they could hear everything: the roar of the crowd, the clatter of cages being opened, the sudden silence that sometimes followed a kill. The arena above them functioned with mechanical efficiency. Death had a schedule, and the schedule rarely paused. Not everyone in Roman society approved of the games. Philosophers occasionally criticized the brutality of the spectacles. Among the most famous was the Stoic thinker Seneca the Younger, who once described leaving the arena feeling disturbed by what he had witnessed. But criticism rarely translated into change. For most Romans, the games were not seen as moral failures. They were traditions, public festivals, celebrations tied to religion, politics, and civic identity. In other words, the arena did not exist outside Roman culture. It expressed it. And that may be the most unsettling part of the story. Because the people filling those seats were not monsters. They were merchants, soldiers, artisans, and children. Ordinary citizens participating in what their society had taught them was normal. The spectacles continued for centuries. Even emperors remembered for wisdom and moderation. such as Marcus Aurelius, presided over games during their reigns. The scale varied, the enthusiasm shifted, but the institution remained. Eventually, however, something changed. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire was no longer the unstoppable power it had once been. Wars drained resources, trade networks weakened. Maintaining enormous spectacles became increasingly expensive. Gradually, the games faded. Not through a sudden moral awakening, but through economic exhaustion. Without funding, the machinery of the arena simply stopped. The Colosseum fell silent. Over time, earthquakes damaged its outer walls. Stones were taken to build churches and palaces. Grass began to grow where sand once absorbed blood. Today, millions of visitors walk through its arches each year. They admire the scale of the structure, the precision of Roman engineering, the sense of standing inside something ancient and immense. But the arena's original purpose is easy to forget. The architecture survives. Most of the people who pass through its gates do not. Their names were rarely recorded. Their stories disappeared almost as quickly as the sand was raked smooth for the next spectacle. And yet the system that produced those spectacles endured for nearly 400 years. Which leaves a difficult question hanging over the ruins. Not why Rome created the arena, but why it took so long for anyone to decide it should end. History rarely gives us easy answers. Sometimes it simply shows us what human societies have been willing to accept, and how easily those boundaries can shift when violence becomes part of a story people want to believe. If you found yourself drawn into this darker corner of the ancient world, consider subscribing for more deeply researched historical documentaries like this one. And if there's a forgotten empire, figure, or moment in history you think deserves to be explored next, share it in the comments, because the past still has many stories waiting beneath the surface.